Welcome to Storytime. Today, we'll be reading from the subreddit r/NuclearRevenge, where OP's dad gets rid of his brother. Why we don't see Uncle Mark anymore. So, this was recently told to me by my dad over a drink. He'd gotten a little drunk and ended up admitting it to me. He said it's been long enough and he had paid the consequences, so there was nothing to come back on him. This is the only reason I'm posting this. Uncle Mark was my favorite uncle when I was a child. He always invited me around to show me his airsoft gun collection, played hide and seek at parties with my friends, and he even took us to the beach. He would always come out with sweets for us and acted just like one of us, another child who just wanted to have fun. But then, one day when I was 7 years old, we were supposed to be going for a ride to this amazing place. My dad was happy and cheerful for the entire day. He was going on and on about how much he loved the fact that his brother wanted to be in his children's life. Until he got a call. I was in my room packing my stuff when I heard the most blood-curdling scream from my dad. He was screaming and raging. I heard him rip open our front door and slam it back shut with enough force to make the picture next to it fall off the wall. I didn't see my dad for a long while after that, and he never told me why until we had this talk. But that's going to be explained at the end. My mom had a lot of money saved up from a minor lotto win, so we were okay, and she always smiled and said, "Daddy is just away for a little while because he was looking after me and my siblings," whenever I asked where he was. Uncle Mark didn't come around either during this time, but we did see him in town a couple of times. Funnily enough, he would run away the moment my mom saw me waving at him. 9 months later, my dad came home, and I excitedly ran and hugged him. He hugged me right back with a good squeeze. We had a party to celebrate him coming home. We had party food and cake and all the usual stuff. I was just happy my dad was home. A week or so later, Dad sat me down with the other children and explained that Uncle Mark wouldn't be coming around anymore. When we asked why, he just said Uncle Mark was a bad person, and that if he ever tried to talk to us, we were to ignore him and come find one of them. We all agreed because my dad always knew best after all. One day, a year or so later, I'm 9 at this point, I'm coming out of school to wait for my parents to pick me up. My other siblings were either at secondary school or too young for school, so it was just me. I see Uncle Mark standing there with a big grin. I get nervous when he comes up to me, saying he's here to take me for a ride. I tell him I'm not supposed to talk to him, that he's a bad person like my dad said. Uncle Mark got this scary look on his face for a second, and then told me it was all good and my parents had changed their mind, and he went to take my hand. That's when I saw my dad just appear. My dad punched Uncle Mark right in the face, and little old me saw blood fly as Uncle Mark went sprawling. I didn't see much after that except Uncle Mark running away with my dad chasing behind him. He came back after a little while, sighed, and took me in a hug. He told my mom to take me home and that he would see us later. I don't know why, but I knew right then and there it would be a long time before I ever saw my dad again. And I was right. 5 years. 5 years my dad was gone. My mom eventually admitted to us that he was in prison for protecting us, and we all guessed he'd done something to Uncle Mark. And he had. It turns out Uncle Mark liked kids. He liked them a lot. And that day I was meant to go to his house. My aunt, Uncle Mark's wife, had called my dad and told him she'd found some pictures under her and Mark's bed of children, and she was scared of what to do because Mark was a big man, and it was later revealed he abused her, so she was scared to call the police on him, and my dad had gone into a rage and stormed over to his house. He smashed in the door to find Uncle Mark screaming at my aunt as she waved the pictures around in hysterics. My dad had beaten Uncle Mark within an inch of his life. Uncle Mark was screaming, saying he'd make him pay as the police arrested my dad. Messed up thing was, by the time my dad had explained why he had done it, Mark had managed to get the pictures and burn them and scared his wife into saying nothing, so there was no evidence. My dad was sent in for assault, but he made sure my other uncles and older cousins were around to protect us in case Mark ever came back. But oh no. Mark waited until my dad thought we were safe. And then, according to my dad, Uncle Mark had come to kidnap me from school right under their noses. Who would stop him? People didn't believe my dad when he explained Mark was a predator. They thought he was just excusing himself for attacking him. After all, the police hadn't found anything, and his wife said my dad was a liar, whereas my dad was this big angry guy with a few assaults under his belt already. So all they saw was my nice uncle here to come pick me up. He had gotten away from my dad at the school. My dad had tripped and gave him the chance to run, but my dad knew where he would go. He knew Uncle Mark would run home and hide, more than likely destroy any evidence he had gotten since destroying the last bit. He also knew the police would be on his tail for the attack on the school, so he didn't have long. Difference was, though, my dad had his car while Uncle Mark was on foot. So he drove over and demanded to know if my aunt was going to lie again after what Uncle Mark had just tried to pull. Now, I don't like my aunt much after what she pulled the first time, but I think in that moment, she really realized what a monster my uncle was. He was willing to do this to her nephew just for pathetic revenge for being called out as a predator. She said she wouldn't stop my dad or save Mark this time. My dad ordered her to get all the evidence she could as he waited for Mark to appear. She came back down with pictures. Lots of pictures. He then told her to go, wait 1 hour, and then call the police. He was ending this. And as Uncle Mark appeared, my dad, who'd been waiting behind the wall of his garden, slammed him into the door of his own house. He then proceeded to beat him to death in his doorway. He apparently, towards the end, couldn't see the floor through the blood. My dad was arrested on murder and did so without resistance, only saying he'd wish they'd done his job for him. But when it was revealed that Uncle Mark was indeed a predator who had attempted to kidnap me, and the fact that they had to face the fact that he had allowed a predator to run free, he was instead charged for manslaughter. His lawyer stated my father had gone into a protective rage and had only intended to render him harmless. Funnily enough, no one argued in defense of the predator for my dad getting the murder charges. He said he didn't regret it, but that he wished he had done something else purely so that he didn't miss out on so much of my life. I told him I was forever proud of him and that I loved him. I was a bit shocked I wasn't told just what Uncle Mark was for so long, but my dad asked if it would have made it any better to be told as a child what he really was, or now as a man who can handle the truth. And he's right. Me as a child would not have been able to mentally handle it. I'm barely able to handle it now. Wow, OP, it really sounds like you dodged a huge bullet there. That's like one of the craziest stories I've ever seen on Reddit, to be honest. I don't really know how to process that because that just seems like something that just doesn't happen to most people, you know? And I mean, thank goodness it doesn't happen. But yeah, your dad took matters into his own hands, I guess. That seemed like the only option. And that's crazy that he had to go away for so long. And I hope you're doing okay. And he's probably right. You know, it's better to probably not know as a kid and you just leave so confused, and now you just know the truth and you're more able to handle it. This story was posted by Leading Road 8119. Bully tries to act like it was in school. Guess I will tell on you then. In secondary school, I was tormented by a specific bully. For years, I was beaten up and publicly humiliated on a daily basis. The worst thing he did was beat me up so bad that I got a concussion and broken ribs when I was 14. He never faced any consequences in school because his family was rich and he was pretty popular. For context, I live in a pretty small town in England, so everyone knows everyone, including the bully. He left school when I was 17, and I didn't see him for about a year. Around this time, I got way more popular and started going to parties and making more friends. And annoyingly, he was friends with some of my friends, and his girlfriend was at my school, but I managed to avoid him mostly until I finished school. Unfortunately, I saw him a few months later. Him and my friends went to the pub to celebrate our exam results, and he was a complete jerk to me. He started insulting me and mocking me to my friends, saying, "Why do you hang out with OP?" Bringing up a bunch of stuff from years ago. And at one point, he put me in a headlock and told me that my friends only hung out with me out of pity. I wasn't going to take it, but I also wasn't going to get into a fight because I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of getting me angry. And right at that moment, I overheard the most perfect thing. He was bragging to his friends about the house party he was having and saying about all the drugs he was going to take at the party, and said he had it all in his car. It wasn't just a bit of weed either, if I remember correctly. He said he had 13 bags of coke, about 30 pills of MDMA, and 7 or 8 grams of ketamine. And then I knew what I would do for my revenge on that guy. As he was leaving, I followed him to his car and took a photo of his license plate. And then after he was driving off, I walked in and called the police. I knew they needed something more than hearsay to stop the car, and I didn't want to be traced back to it. So I told the police I saw my bully snorting a white powder in the pub. This was a complete fabrication. And then get into the driver's seat of the car. I then provided them with the license plate of the car and told them the direction they were heading in. I honestly didn't think they were going to stop him, or maybe they would ask him questions later and ruin his party. But the driving on drugs allegation, plus the fact that he had been arrested for minor possession before, which I didn't know at the time, was enough for the police to take it seriously and stop and search his car, which they found all the drugs he was transporting to his party. He got arrested for it. The consequences of his arrest meant he lost out on his university place. His rich parents had enough of his behavior, so they kicked him out and cut him off from their funds. And a rumor I heard was that in turn for a lower sentence, my bully ratted out his supplier, which resulted in him getting stabbed multiple times. And as a consequence of that, he now has to wear a colostomy bag, and that plus his criminal record means he is currently unemployed. That is some serious nuclear revenge, OP, and I mean, if the rumor is true, I mean, that's not really your fault. I mean, he was kind of stupid for having all of that in his car and then bragging about it, and then is like dumb enough to out his supplier. Like, yeah, those people mean business, and he's stupid enough not to know that. So I'm not going to say he got what he deserved, but I mean, maybe he kind of did. Our next story was posted by Lucario Stormblade, a nuclear revenge tale that took 15 years to pay off. Hey people, this nuclear revenge tale took 15 years to finally resolve, and I couldn't be happier. First, some background is needed to get the setup. My ex-stepfather, and I refuse to acknowledge that he married my mother, and since my mother is dead, I shouldn't have to anymore, is an awful man. My mother married him because she thought I needed a man in my life to help raise me. He was abusive verbally and was just a toxic person to be around. Even when my mother and he divorced, he still insisted on trying to see me, and I had to be forced to go see him and his new wife every other weekend. When I moved away from the city he was in, due to me ending up in foster care, I didn't bother looking him up, nor trying to find out if he was even still alive. So when I moved back in 2008, I was kind of surprised to find out he was still alive. Sorry for the lead up, but this is where the foundation of the revenge takes place. When I moved back to the city, I worked my butt off and bought my first car, a 1992 Buick Regal Custom. I loved that car, and I also loved helping people out, which was a lot easier with the car. Well, my ex-stepdad knew about the car because he had seen me driving around town, running errands for the local homeless shelter where I volunteered, taking guys to the doctor's office when they didn't want to wait on a bus, stuff like that. And he was a resident at said shelter. Through my volunteer work at the shelter, I had befriended a couple of young guys who had landed on hard times, and they were just working odd jobs to save up money to move back to their hometown, the same town I had moved back from the city from. After hearing about this and their plans to just get a Greyhound down there, I told them no, I would actually drive them there for like $40 in gas, saving them about $250. We made arrangements and set a date for their departure. Apparently, my ex-stepdad heard about this, so he cornered them in the shower that night, told them that he was going to have his way with them, and that I would be expecting the same kind of payment when I got them to that town. When they refused, he threatened to kill them, so they finally accepted. When I pulled up to pick them up the next morning, I could tell something was off, like something had happened. Yesterday, these two guys were eager to leave the city behind, and now they treated my car as if it had live vipers in the passenger seat. So I asked them what was up. They told me they didn't know about leaving the city with me, and I assured them that it would be fine, not knowing what my ex-stepdad had done the night prior. After a little coaxing, and me mentioning that the Greyhound doesn't even run up to where they were trying to go, they loaded up my trunk and off we went. I could feel the tension in the car, and it had become so thick that you could slice through it with a knife. After we crossed into the neighboring state, they asked me if I would just drop them off at a hotel, and that they would try to find other accommodations down to where they were going. I said I wouldn't mind, but wanted to know what brought on the sudden change of plans. After a tearful choking up in the back seat, they told me what had transpired the night before with my ex-stepdad, and I saw red. Oh, I absolutely despise this man. I wanted to know I needed to hurt him, but how? After assuring the two boys that they were going to be fine and that I wasn't even about to put them through what he did, they finally allowed me to take them all the way to their town. I instructed them to file assault charges against him and to make sure they submit DNA samples to the police, and they assured me that they would. On the way back, I plotted my revenge against him, and that's when it dawned on me. My ex-stepdad was a registered offender for some stupid night when he was 16. He had told me before that he was caught urinating on an elementary school swing set as a youth, and that he had to register. That was the main reason I ended up in foster care to begin with. Something about child endangerment. Bureaucratic BS. I also know that he didn't register in our state for the last couple of years because, had he did, he would have been kicked out of the shelter he was staying in, since they do a 3 times a day, 7-day-a-week community outreach meal for not only the residents, but those who needed a hot meal that day, which would also include children. So on the way back, I had informed the Office of Admissions staff that they had an offender in their shelter, and that if they didn't get him out, I would report the shelter to the police. They had one of those safe spot stickers designated the shelter as a safe space for kids. Did I forget to mention that this shelter also ran a youth summer camp and had a youth correctional facility and the library right next to it? They took action almost immediately, but when they went to evict him, he was nowhere to be seen. He had taken off, not to be seen again. Or so I thought. You see, when he vanished from the shelter that day, he thought the safest place to hide out was his hometown, 9 states away. A smarter person would have looked up what his registration entailed, and would have known that fleeing across state lines without informing law enforcement is a felony. And it doesn't just stop at the state one left, but carries over to every state between the point of origin and destination. So he had racked up over 9 felony charges against him, just for that one little jaunt. Fast forward to about 3 months ago, I get a message from the 2 boys on Facebook, asking me for my new number. I give it to them, and I'm almost immediately put in touch with the county sheriff, who had a federal agent in his office. He was asking me if I knew where my ex-stepdad was. As I was telling both gentlemen that I didn't have a clue, my Facebook pinged. It was my ex-stepdad's wife, telling me to give her husband a chance to reconcile. Gag. A quick look on her page revealed that they were together, living in my hometown, and what's more, seriously, future Darwin Award winners here, they were living next door to the school he was caught urinating on all those years ago. I relayed that information to both gentlemen and asked them what charges they had on him. They said they had 2 counts of statutory on him, and 3 counts of felony evasion. I mentioned his failure to register, and the day he left my hometown, he had ran to his hometown, 9 states away. The county sheriff informed me that he was calling from that county, and he wasn't aware of the failure to register charges, but thanked me for informing him. Ladies and gentlemen, that dirtbag nearly ruined my life. My trust with other people and my reputation in my hometown was finally getting what was owed to him. 25 to life for everything. And he isn't eligible for parole for another 17 years, if he lives that long. He is better off rotting in the depths of Tartarus for the lives he ruined. I love a good what an idiot story, because it's like, dang, if you just weren't so stupid, maybe you could have gotten away with it. I mean, obviously, I'm glad he didn't get away with any of this. I mean, it clearly went on for like too long. But yeah, this is like my favorite kind of story. It's just like, wow, if you would have just been smart enough to not do like, well, one of those, but all of those things, like, you know, you could have just kept living your really crappy little life, but instead you chose the wrong thing. And here you are, rotting away in prison. I love it. Our next story was posted by Almost Fungible. Terrible boss gets his comeuppance. Setting: high volume independent tire shop in northern New England, circa 2012. We'll call it 123 Tire. The target: evil general manager. We'll call him Jay. Aggrieved parties: basically everybody that worked there at the time, but mainly myself and the receptionist. We'll call her Ruth. Here's the backstory. So Jay had been the GM of 123 Tires since he got the previous GM fired in 2004. He is a complete narcissist who believed he could do no wrong, and if you didn't agree with him, God help you. Over the years, Jay had done a number of illegal things. For example, he was always very physical with his employees. One time, he was wrestling with another salesman. This was commonplace and unavoidable if you valued your job. And the salesman, we'll call him Paul, took a bad fall and broke his knee. In order to avoid the ire of the owner, we'll call him Lou, Jay immediately clocked Paul out and told him to go to the hospital. He also told Paul to use his own insurance and that the company would pay the deductible in order to avoid a messy workers' comp claim. Paul did as he was told and kept his job, but his knee was never the same, and he ended up addicted to opioids thanks to Jay's actions. Jay also had an affinity for the ladies. Now, I must mention here that Jay is an ultra-conservative Christian father of 11 children who believes that a woman's place is uneducated, barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen. That being said, several female receptionists came and went over the years, with only Ruth sticking around because she needed the money and begrudgingly accepted the regular sexual harassment. When he wasn't behaving inappropriately with every lady that walked in the door, he was behaving inappropriately with every other employee. Want to leave early on a slow day? Wrestle the biggest guy in the shop for it. Jay was big on wrestling. I suspected Jay may also have been wrestling with his daughters, but couldn't prove it. The guy was a real creep. Big guy isn't in that day? Buy him a pizza. Trying to have lunch? Expect Jay to throw food at you. Want to schedule a vacation? Tough. He'll let you know the week before if you can't take it. He was a complete child. And I put up with him for 6 long years because I couldn't let him win. Here's the setting. It was the summer of 2012, and Ruth and I had had enough. Jay was completely out of control, as usual, now telling me, a Latino, that if Obama won re-election, that he would make my work life a living hell come November. Ruth was going through a divorce, and he was trying to move in on her. For the record, Ruth hated Jay. It was time to hit him where it hurt. Ruth was ready to drop a lawsuit for sexual harassment on Jay and 123 Tire, and I was ready to drop one for constructive discharge. Now, suing an employer doesn't exactly look good on one's cover letter, but we were both at our wits' end. The revenge. Ruth and I decided, one evening, that Jay's ultra-conservative values must be shared by his wife and family. As he was always working, his wife must be the one who goes to the mailbox every day. I created Throwaway Mail and got him a Bill Me Later subscription to Hustler magazine, and Playboy, and Penthouse. Fast forward a couple weeks, and he comes in looking like death warmed over. Turns out Mrs. J didn't appreciate his new taste in reading material, and he's now living in a motel in the next town over. Now, he's not saying that his wife kicked him out. He's far too much of a narcissist for that. But I could put 2 and 2 together. He's decided that he's done with his wife and 11 children, and that he is going to start a new life with Ruth. After all, her divorce is going to be finalized at the end of the week. It was at this point that Lou's sister, the co-owner of 123 Tire, and not a big fan of Jay, we'll call her Liz, overheard him talking to Ruth in a less than business appropriate manner. Liz later took Ruth aside and got the scoop on what had been happening for the last several years, and that was that. The next morning, Lou called Jay to his office and was far kinder than I would have been. Jay was to lose his title of GM and go to work at another 123 Tire location an hour away until the end of the year. Beginning in 2013, Jay would need to find other employment. Jay was also not to contact the location that he had overseen and worked in for years. Also, the location that Jay was relocated to added an hour to his already 1 hour long commute. I suspect that Lou also encouraged Jay to reconcile with his wife, which Jay did. The epilogue. Jay ended his employment with 123 Tire in January of 2013 and never suspected any involvement from me. In fact, to this day, he stays in occasional contact with me. He went on to work for another tire store, this one a corporate chain, as a store manager. Put his house on the market, bought a new one closer to his new employer and everything. A year later, he was fired after bringing a 7-figure lawsuit on them. They settled out of court, and he moved back to the house he was in before, as it hadn't sold. Jay's next job was 5 minutes from his home, and his new boss was the guy that Jay had gotten fired back in 2004. That one lasted a couple of years, until Jay gave up on finding employment in the area and moved himself and the whole family to the Midwest sometime around 2016. Now in the Midwest, Jay has been unable to keep a job in the car business for more than a year, and as soon as each of his kids turn 18, they seem to move right back to the area they grew up in. His New England home sold in 2019 for less than he bought it for. Ruth still works for 123 Tire and is very happy there now. Here's the icing on the cake. In early 2021, I finally left my job at 123 Tire, sold my house, and became a full-time RVer. I've seen 47 U.S. states, including the Midwestern state and town that Jay now resides in. I looked him up when I got there, and he came to see me after he got off work in my new RV. He said, "Boy, you must really think something of me to look me up and want to see me all the way out here." If only he knew the half of it. Okay, my first thought is I'm just wondering why we even stay in contact with this fool. Whatever, no harm done, I guess. Since, no one, I guess the guy with the knee thing got kind of hurt. So, yeah, if I was him, I definitely wouldn't. But I guess it feels kind of good to, look someone in the eye when they have no idea, all of the things that you went through to get him to where he is now, which sounds like a not very good place. Yeah, that must feel pretty good, actually. So, props to you, OP. This is some pretty good revenge, I must say. Those long time coming ones always feel like the most satisfying. This story was posted by Proud Fisherman 5233. Try to sexually harass my grandma? You might take backing up. Setting, early 60s, medium-sized Midwestern city, a local neighborhood bar. The title of this story comes from my grandma's old saying. See, my grandma always carries a switchblade in her purse for protection, and she said that if anyone ever tried to attack her, they might get her, but she's gonna take a piece of them. Hence her term, I'll take back a nub. Some context about my grandma before we get into story time. My grandma was born in the Deep South back in the 30s. She was one of 4 sisters, who I will refer to for the rest of this as the 4 sisters. My family decided to migrate up to a northern Midwest city in the 50s. Just for clarification, my family is African American, So, if you know anything about the United States history, you would understand why they would want to escape the Deep South during this time period. My grandma was 20-something when she moved north with her husband, my grandfather. The rest of her family, her sisters, mother, and uncle, also moved up north. Because of housing discrimination, my grandparents were forced to live in the black neighborhood. The rest of the family also lived in this neighborhood and were basically within walking distance of each other. The thing to know about the four sisters is that they were all Spitfires. They are some of the most caring women you know and were all excellent mothers and grandmothers, but they were not to be trifled or messed with. If you crossed one of them, that might be your end. This was especially true of my grandmother, who was all of 5'1" and fairly petite. The four sisters were quite the characters, and it didn't take the neighborhood long to know of the four sisters because of their crazy antics. They also loved hanging out with each other on the weekends, either at one of their houses or sometimes at one of the local watering holes. On this particular night, my grandma wanted to go out for a few hours with their sisters. Only one could go. We'll call her Aunt C. My uncle, my grandma's oldest son, was in charge of watching his siblings for a few hours on this lovely Saturday night as my grandma dressed to the nines and headed down about half a mile to the local bar to meet up with her sister. This was a pretty small bar that got a lot of regulars. My grandma had been there dozens of times and has plenty of stories to tell about her time there with her sisters and also my grandfather. My grandma and Aunt C are lounging in the bar, having a couple of drinks and cracking some jokes with some of the regulars when a new character is introduced into the scene. This guy's name is Leroy. He was a regular as well. To picture this guy, you want to think about a guy as skinny as Jimmy Walker and about the height of Kevin Hart. Combine this and make him about the age of 40 and you have Leroy. Almost everyone will know Kevin Hart, but if you're not sure who Jimmy Walker is, look up the sitcom Good Times and you'll figure out who he is. Leroy was a regular at the bar, but then again, Leroy was a regular at almost every bar in town. You see, kids, before the internet, online dating apps and hookup sites, the way most people met was at bars. Our good friend Leroy was notorious for wanting to have one-night rendezvous with the ladies at the bar. Well, everyone knew his game, and after he has had a few one-night stands with some of the ladies in the neighborhood, most now avoided him like the plague. This, of course, didn't stop him from going to bars on a weekend, trying his best to shoot a shot, and hoping a lovely filly might come home with him for the night. Leroy had flirted with my grandma and aunt on previous occasions, and even though he was told that they were both happily married, he kept trying to have a conversation with them. As soon as he entered, he once again strolled over there, trying to see if he could get some action with either of them. My grandma quickly told him not to waste his breath, but he sat down anyway. What surprised my grandma was that behind Leroy was another guy. He was well over 6 feet tall and handsome. My grandma honestly couldn't recall this guy's name, so we'll call him Jerk. My grandma knew right away that this Billy D. Williams wannabe was gonna try to sweet talk and charm his way into some lady's pants that night. It seems that he had his sights set on his first target, which would be, of course, my grandmother and Aunt C. It seems like our good friend Leroy was gonna try to be Jerk's wingman. He started off with some small talk to my grandma. He wanted to tell her how gorgeous she was and something about getting lost in her eyes and all the other nonsense. My grandma said that he had diarrhea of the mouth and pretty much let what he said go in one ear and out the other. My grandma quickly shut this clown down and let him know she wasn't interested. So then he set his sights on my aunt. The jerk made a comment about how nice my aunt's thighs were as he looked lustfully at her. My grandma quickly told this fool that my aunt was married and not interested in his nonsense. This is where the story changes and revenge comes into place. Grandma, she's not interested and she is happily married. Jerk, she can speak for herself. Your legs must be tired because you've been running through my mind all night. Yes, this fool used a pickup line. Grandma, are you hard of hearing or something, or a little slow? I told you she's married and not interested. Jerk, witch, you talk too much. Maybe I'll put what's in my pants down your throat. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where it got real. Yes, everybody else in the bar knew you wouldn't and shouldn't talk to my grandma that way. She didn't play that nonsense. This is one of those times where you could actually hear a pin drop as everyone got quiet. My grandma exploded with an expected, "What in the F did you just say?" My grandma was seething with anger, but Jerkface played it off as if it wasn't a good idea. My Aunt C knew what was about to go down. She grabbed my grandma and started leading her to the door. You see, my sister knew what many other people knew, and that is my grandma kept a .38 snub-nose revolver in her purse, and typically kept a very sharp switchblade wrapped up in her bra. My aunt tried to lead my grandma out of the bar to avoid any more confrontation, but my grandma wasn't having it. As she was being pushed out of the door by my aunt and another male customer, my grandma seized a nearby beer glass and flung it towards the jerk. Fortunately, the glass didn't hit him and erupted close to his feet, but it certainly got his attention. This well over 6-foot man, well, over 200-pound man, jumped out of this chair and towards my grandma, saying that he will kick her butt. My grandma replies, "Bring it on, bring it on." She eventually gets fully outside and he decides to come outside. He's a little apprehensive because a couple of the neighborhood bar dudes had gotten up to see this, and he's afraid they also might get involved. You know, since it's unacceptable for a man to hit a woman and all that jazz. The guys said they're not going to do anything and they just want to watch. My grandma quickly pulled out the switchblade that she had in her bra, unwrapped it from the paper, and looked him in the eyes and said, "Come here, mother effer." You would think at this point any civilized person might be apologizing further for the crude language he used earlier, or you would think that the guy, seeing that my grandma had heels on, might just walk away, knowing she's probably not going to chase after them. Do you think this clown chose either option? If you said he chose neither option, you would be correct. Let's give you a prize, son. With a woman with a switchblade bearing down on him, he decides to stand his ground and doubles down by again calling my grandmother a witch and telling her he's going to beat her up. He next starts pulling up his fist, ready to go to town. No worries, no one says my grandma has to fight fair. You see, what this clown forgot about was my aunt. While Jerk has his fist up ready to start striking like he is Mike Tyson, my aunt has conveniently took off one of her high heel shoes. She uses the heel to bash him right in the shoulder blades. Of course, this staggers our young Jerk. As he turns around looking at my aunt and screaming obscenities, it gave my grandma time to come up and slice this fool right in his side. As our young Jerk howls in pain, my grandma says to him, "Maybe I should slice something else off." The Jerk staggers away sideways, looking at two infuriated women, one with her high heels still in her hand and the other with the switchblade and the sight of blood on it. Don't worry, he wasn't too badly hurt, as she sliced him but didn't stab him. By this point, a few other people are stepping in and are trying to calm the situation down, and the Jerk left the scene. The aftermath. My grandma heard from others that the Jerk went to the hospital and got treatment for getting sliced on the side. This was the 60s, so no cops were called, and if they had been called, they probably would have been really slow getting to the scene. No idea what he told the hospital staff and doctors, but regardless, we heard that he got patched up. Rumor has it that he ended up moving to Chicago a few months later. He never tried to get revenge on my grandma for this, so there's that. My grandma says she wasn't going to tell my grandfather about what happened. He was an on-the-road trucker and was out of town when this event occurred. But you know how things quickly go through the grapevine. He of course scolded her for this, but she just gave him a wicked smile and said that the asshole deserved it, and that he came at her, so it was self-defense anyway. Not sure that's exactly entirely true, but that's what she's sticking with. My grandma continued going to that bar every once in a while, and was a bit of a legend. Our friend Leroy ended up being the epitome of a deadbeat dad. Rumor had it that he had something like 10 kids with 8 or 9 different women. My grandma still has a switchblade, and yeah, she showed it to me. It's somewhere in her massive collection of items now. Otherwise, I would have attached a picture of it. Honestly, I wish like we could all just have that friend who, maybe doesn't have a switchblade, but uses their words like a switchblade. Like, if you don't have that friend, you should have one. I do. It's nice to have around because you're never scared, right? It's like amazing to hear in real life, though. Like these fools who just think they can mess around, but dude, you never know what's coming for you. Word wise to all those men out there who think that they can just overpower someone because they're a woman or they're smaller. Hey, they might have a switchblade in their bra, so be careful out there, y'all. That's all for today. Thank you for listening. We really appreciate it. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. If you would like to listen to us on the go, you can listen to our podcast. The link will be in the description below. See you soon. Bye.